Hey everybody, welcome to Law and Society. So I was doing that episode on extreme weather, and halfway through the episode, I realized that I should probably talk to you about personal experiences of extreme weather, um, which would probably make a bigger difference in understanding. So, the first example that I can give you of experiencing extreme weather is not an actual experience of it, but rather an experience of the aftermath of it. So, Hurricane Katrina hit about uh, 2006, I think, 2006, around that time. And I was just starting out law school. So, the third year of law school, a group of us from our school decided that we wanted to go down to Louisiana 2 years after the hurricane, so we could help the federal government over there with handling of the bookwork and document review of the bankruptcies that were happening in the New Orleans area, the greater Louisiana uh, area. And so as we drove down from Michigan to Louisiana, it was a long, fun drive, but I remember coming down, and as we got into the state, we saw highways that were uh, lined by used and thrown away FEMA um, you know, makeshift homes, those FEMA trailers that were now just waste because there was a formaldehyde problem with them. And I remember driving into Katrina just with those images of miles and miles of these, uh, FEMA trailers dumped on the side of the highway. And then we got to uh, New Orleans, and the city proper of New Orleans was fine. It was, we were that's where we were. That's where the federal courthouse was. That's where the bankruptcy was. And the bankruptcy judge told us, usually we have over 20 or 30 bankruptcies that we have lined up on our docket, but over the last 2 years, their docket has faced a surge of 1,000%, where they have 2,000 plus bankruptcy cases backlogged. This was 2 years after Katrina hit New Orleans. So that was one of the experiences that I had that really shocked me early on when extreme weather was just starting out, that the impact it can have on the economy of an area years and years after that place has experienced a natural disaster. And then, we went to the Ninth Ward and we saw these houses, and they were marked with X's, and there were water lines on the middle of the houses. That's where the levees broke for Katrina. It wasn't in the center of the city. It wasn't in the French quarters where that happened. It happened outside in the outer areas of New Orleans that were socioeconomically in the lower income level, as opposed to the French Quarter, which is the highest sort of income group, the most expensive real estate. And that area was fine. I don't know whether it was because of the storm didn't reach that way, or because the levees broke already, so the harm was overwhelming in the Ninth Ward than it was in other parts of the city. But that's what I saw. That's what I experienced. We spent about a week there, maybe 10 days or so, which is kind of like a drop in the bucket, but there were a lot of other third-year law students from a lot of other parts of the country who were coming throughout that summer to continue to help, and they had been coming for 2 years, and the backlog still remained. So the next experience I had of extreme weather was the snowstorm that hit Chicago when I was living in Chicago in 2011. And I remember I was driving my partner to work, and it was a 20-minute drive from where we lived up in Rogers Park to his workplace, which was in the Magnificent Mile. It's about a 20-30 minute drive. And as I was driving, it started snowing. And we knew that we were going to get a big blizzard. But we didn't realize how quickly the blizzard would form. So here I am driving. We get in the car, and I remember clearly this. There was not much snow on the ground at all. It was just starting to snow. So we get to his workplace. In about 30 minutes, the snow had started from being just mild to where it was getting near to, clear, from clear visibility to no visibility. And then I got back on Lakeshore Drive, and by then, the Lakeshore Drive was accumulating snow. This is like in a span of 30 minutes. And then I turn around about when I get back, and I'm getting back off of Lakeshore Drive, getting up to Rogers Park, and I remember thinking that I need to call my partner when I get home and tell him that he probably needs me to come pick him up. So I got home, and it was still snowing. By now, it was maybe about half to the wheel of the car. The roads were still drivable. And as soon as I got home, I got a phone call from my partner saying, well, they're saying they're going to close down work today, so can you come pick me up? I said, of course, better sooner now than later on, because the snow wasn't stopping. So at this time, it took me about an hour to get to where it takes me about half an hour to get to, because the snow had it was now falling, and Lakeshore Drive was accumulating snow. And if anybody is familiar with Chicago, Lakeshore Drive is like the thorough line that goes through the sort of the east side of Chicago, and it's like this backbone of cars that go up and down that allow for intra-city. It's sort of an intra-city highway. And so I picked him up, and then we get back on Lakeshore Drive, and we're ending up. This whole thing happened in the matter of hour and a half, and cars were getting stuck on the roads because the people who were clearing out the ice, the snow couldn't clear it out soon enough. And within the span of an hour and a half, so much snow had accumulated that my car also got stuck in the snow. And thankfully, it was not that bad that we kind of pushed the car, slid it off with the help of, I think, a couple of other people, and then we finally got home. And I was like, I'm parking the car now, and we're not going to move and see what happens. Well, in the next 24 hours, the Chicago area got 21 inches of snow, which made it the third biggest blizzard in recorded Chicago history. One happened in the 1960s, then one in 1999, and this was in 2011. So the frequency of it was getting shorter and more, becoming more frequent, and the intensity was such that we essentially were homebound for like 4 days because everything was covered in snow, and you really couldn't get out of the house without being knee-deep in snow for about 4 days or so. So my third experience with extreme weather was when I decided that right after Hurricane Sandy hit New York, I wanted to go and help New York, people of New York in any way that I could. So I flew there. My friend lived at Stuyvesant Town, which is in Manhattan. And I remember that there was still debris there. But the city, Manhattan, when I say city proper, it's Manhattan, and then the city, greater city being, the other other four boroughs. So I remember that I went to Brooklyn, to Red Hook, to a church to make food, to be able to send to the food kitchens that were out in the Rockaways and out in areas that are, again, far flung from the city center, where Manhattan was up and running. Maybe 3 days or 4 days, no, I'm sorry, was it a week? Maybe a week after the hurricane hit, there was still debris. There was still remnants of the storm having hit. It wasn't like New York was completely normal, but this. So I went to that church. We got supplies one day. I remember another day we cooked food, and another day we decided we were going to go there and we would, uh, you know, deliver the food and also help the National Guard and other volunteers with giving away necessary supplies like toothbrushes and toothpaste and what people needed that they didn't have. And the stories from the Rockaways were just chilling. I remember talking over lunch with this lady who said that, she pointed at her tower, which was next to another subsidized housing tower. And I remember her talking about as soon as the water surge started to happen and they realized what was happening, she was in the building next door, but she had to get home. But when she got down, she realized that water was already so high that she had to swim that I think it was like 30 feet from her friend's apartment building to her apartment building. And it was such a harrowing experience, she remembered, because it was dark. And I remember these stories because they have an impact on me in terms of extreme weather. And then I've experienced the aftermath of some of these weather storms. And then I moved, when I moved to India, I experienced a hurricane. Here it would be called a cyclone. And I remember the far-flung areas of the city where I live they were devastated. And this happened about a decade ago, and not even a decade ago, I think a few years before the COVID pandemic hit, and it literally blew through these areas, and the city was in shambles because there were trees that had been uprooted in the cities all over the place, and the city was not operational for a good week, and it was kind of a harrowing experience. I lived in the middle of the city, so I wasn't as affected. And the way that my building is oriented, I could literally see the storm go through parallel to my building. I don't know if that makes sense or not. So like rain can come at you if it's coming from one side, but this cyclone was moving in this way. And so when it came to, and my window was here, so it was just whooshing past my window without literally any air coming in through my window. It was bizarre. And I remember the water that was coming with the rain, it was literally lateral. It wasn't falling downwards. It wasn't falling necessarily as much as it was just moving sideways. It was like a river running in front of me with this thawing wind. And people's tiles and all of that got uprooted, and houses were devastated. Thankfully, where I was not as affected, and we got our electricity back without. And I was fortunate, even with the blizzard, even living outside of the center of the city in Chicago, or living in Rogers Park, we still had enough services that we were not impacted by a brownout or a blackout. But I acknowledge and I understand that people experience blackouts and brownouts during extreme weather, which really gets in the way because electricity runs everything around us these days. And then the most recent experience I had was a few months ago when the city of Calcutta experienced a cloudburst. And it's really difficult to explain what a cloudburst is. If you go to England, they joke, and even in parts of India, they joke that we have different names for different gradients of rain. It's drizzling, it's a splash, it's a little bit. Now it's getting to a level of, it's good rainfall is happening. Then there's a downpour. Then there's, raining cats and dogs. And I remember that I went to bed when the rain started around 10 o'clock in the evening, and I was like, this looks like more like, water pouring from the sky as opposed to like rain, because it looked more like sheets of water than droplets of rain. And then I remember waking up in the middle of the night and I look out of the window and it's still raining, and it now, because it's against the lamppost lights, it was just sheets of water. I remember it being zero visibility. I couldn't see the house that's across me, like 30, 40 feet across the street. It was just a film of water, like sheets and sheets and sheets and sheets of water coming down. And my area here doesn't really flood as badly. But I looked down at the streets and the streets were flooded. And I'm like, oh, that's a cloudburst. And I was like, well, I guess I'm going to go to sleep now. And I went to bed. And I woke up in the morning and the entire city was flooded. All services were shut off. There was no going out to work. Everything was flooded. Like, all you could do is sit at home and look at the news, and the people in the news were, standing in water that's halfway up their bodies. And being a low-lying city, it became a problem for Calcutta to drain the water out because of the high tide and low tide and the river system that's just attached that Calcutta is built around, the Ganges river system. So I remember, like, in the first 25 to 30 years of my life, I lived in both these areas for decades, in the Midwest, in Chicago, in central Illinois, in Michigan. And I remember in the first 25 to 30 years of my life, not experiencing much of any of these. But then in the last 15 years of my life, now it's 20 years of my life, I have experienced more extreme weather more frequently and at a rate and in a way that doesn't happen before. And I have been fortunate enough to be in places and circumstances where I didn't have to uproot my whole life, or my life didn't have to be completely uprooted because of the catastrophe, but because of the cloudburst in Calcutta, or the snowstorm blizzard in Chicago, or the cyclones that I experienced, or the aftermath of the hurricanes where I went to volunteer. These all happened from 2010 to 2025. So 15 years. And before that, the previous 30 years of my life, I didn't experience extreme weather like this. Didn't we have thunderstorms? Of course we did. Did we have snowstorms? Of course we did. But were they that extreme? No, not nearly as extreme. Was there rainfall? Yeah, of course there was. But was there deluge like that's happened in Washington State, where 5 trillion gallons of water fell on the state within 24 hours? Where the state is underwater, their silt and the mud that's come out has inundated the houses and cars. You look at it and it's unbelievable. And people are still recovering from Hurricane Helene. And all the while, FEMA is cutting funding for disaster relief. I'm not going to go too far into that, but it is probably one of the dumbest decisions that Donald Trump's regime has made by cutting FEMA. So, with that said, these are my personal experiences with extreme weather, and I remember them so vividly, and I feel for the people who are in the very face of the storm, because there's nothing you can do but just stand there and be at the mercy of nature as it gets more and more and more brutal every single year, and more intense and more wet and more common and more far reaching. Like the Washington floods are connected to the Indonesia cyclones that happened last month, like or earlier this month, in this month. And then that water system went and inundated Washington state, crossing the Pacific Ocean. Just think about the scale of that. And we as a country, we as a people, we as a world need to think about, how do we make ourselves climate resilient? Because if not, there's going to come a time where I will live, no area where I would live would be safe. That Manhattan wouldn't be up and ready in a week after a hurricane like Sandy, because it would be wetter, because it would drown more of the city, because water levels would go up much more with the thawing of the ice caps and the thawing of Greenland. The amount of water that is falling is proportionate to the amount of water that is melting because of rising temperatures, and these heat waves are going to get more extreme in the coming years. So we have to think about, how do we mitigate these situations? And we need to forward think into renewable technologies instead of exacerbating the situation by sticking with petroleum, gasoline, and other fossil fuels like coal, and not go into the renewable sector. We all as a humanity need to work together to abate the crisis that we have coming our way. And there's really nothing we can do to stop it now. Now it is time for us to mitigate the damage. Will we be able to? Will the countries be able to afford it? Will smaller countries crumble? Very likely. Will communities probably crumble? Very likely. Without FEMA help, a lot of communities would crumble. Without government help, without global governmental partnership and help, the climate crisis is going to take more and more and more of our time, cost more and more and more lives, and cause billions and billions and trillions of dollars in damage that we are left with years and years and years after the extreme weather hits any given location. So with that said, I've gone on for 20 minutes, but I really wanted to give you an example of what happens when extreme weather hits certain areas through the vantage point of my personal experiences. And I hope that gives you an idea of how it impacts people's lives and how it can happen anywhere at any time. And all we can do now is prepare and be cognizant that this is happening. With that said, thank you so much for listening. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon.